guru, or should I say Nangadef. Nangadef is Wolof, or it's a greeting in Wolof, and they speak Wolof in Senegal, the Gambia, and Mauritania. And we're getting ready to talk to Dr. Gerald Horne. And Dr. Gerald Horne, I'm thinking about looking at his book, Jazz and Justice, Racism, and the Political Economy of the Music, paperback edition. And I'm introducing it that way because today is tomorrow, pardon me, would have been the 125th anniversary of the birth of Sir Duke Ellington. And I'm going to turn it over to Melinda Francis.
Yeah, I guess want to get right into it. Maybe talk about, because here in Canada, the first encampment kind of started in Montreal. So do you want to talk about the student protests?
Well, the ignition point was at Columbia University, abutting Harlem in Manhattan, New York City. You had an encampment there, but what happens is that the newly installed president of Columbia, who happens to be of Egyptian ancestry, speaking of Professor Shafiq, she was drilled and grilled in Congress a few days ago, and she did not perform well, to put it mildly. She threw some of her faculty overboard in terms of criticizing them, in terms of revealing investigations into them, despite the fact that the investigations were supposed to be confidential. And when she returned to Manhattan, she promptly called the police to disassemble these encampments, even though even the police said that they were peaceful. This was clearly an overreaction, and it ignited a mass protest and solidarity, not to mention the fact that the encampment in Columbia itself increased. It grew in size. It even reached the otherwise sleepy campus of the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, not known for being a hotbed of student activism, where once again, the police invaded the campus at the invitation of the administration and roughhoused the students. I should say that Professor and President Shafiq may have an excuse. That is to say that apparently she's not aware of the class and socioeconomic implications of calling in the police, many of whom are Trump supporters, many of whom have a distorted and demented view of these so-called elite students, and love the opportunity of bashing them over the head, which of course is what they did. You may have seen what happened at Emory University in Atlanta, where a number of women faculty were roughhoused by the authorities. You may have seen what happened at the University of Texas at Austin, where the governor has sent onto the campus at the invitation of the president and at the invitation of the local authorities, police officers on horseback, believe it or not, as if this were Odessa in 1904 or 1905. Obviously, what's happening is that the right wing is seizing the opportunity to get on its moral high horse, pretending to be a combatant against what they call anti-Semitism. That is to say, they're arguing that these protests are anti-Jewish in nature, which helps to solidify the Republicans' alliances with Zionist billionaires, which we talked about before, how that happened historically in the United States, which brings me to a kind of self-criticism. That is to say, not personally, but of the US left writ large. Because what's happening is that these students, quite correctly, are condemning and castigating what they call settler colonialism in historic Palestine. The problem, amongst others, is that the older generations have not prepared the students to recognize that they live in a settler colonial society themselves, which then opens them up for criticism in terms of being inconsistent. I mean, how are you criticizing settler colonialism in Palestine, but not in North America? And then there are the descriptors that are routinely used by our friends on the left, which we've talked about before, but we must talk about again. I'm thinking in the first instance of this descriptor identity politics, which is used to defame Black liberation struggles, even though you can make a credible argument that Black liberation struggles are rooted in struggles of the unpaid sector of the working class, meaning the enslaved, which means that ultimately they could be seen as class struggles. Now, of course, our so-called class reductionists say that everything should be called class struggle, and identity politics should be tossed aside because it's not class struggle, which obviously leads them in a contradiction. Well, the point is that if there is a society on planet Earth that could be called an identity politics society, it's Israel. Here you have a whole nation built upon the ethno-religious identity that is exclusivist and that has been called racist. But I defy you, I dare you to find one person on the US left who has ever called Israel an exemplar of identity politics. Once again, this leads into accusations justifiably of double standards, of hypocrisy. It leaves our younger generation, our students, exposed ideologically, unable to sort out the mess that we've left for them. But I'm happy to say that the students are acquitting themselves well. They're pressuring the university to divest their stock endowments of corporations that are profiting from genocide, particularly the military-industrial complex, but not only the military-industrial complex. They need to be saluted. They're walking in the footsteps of students who a few decades ago launched a similar protest against apartheid South Africa. We know that that protest ended up in a positive direction, as exemplified by the fact that as we speak, we're marking the 30th anniversary of the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994, which came as a partial result of the militancy and the energy and the progressivism and the radicalism and the intelligence of young people from the 1980s and before up through 1994.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. We're talking to Dr. Gerald Horne. Could I ask you a question about, some of the nationalists? I was listening to an interview with the Waistline, Daryl Mitchell, and he referred to Black nationalists as bourgeois nationalists, and I would consider myself among those people that he was criticizing. Don't you think that on the identity politics part, they were right on that issue in terms of calling for Black people to identify with Africa and the Caribbean, where they were originally from, but they were definitely wrong when it came to the question of class?
Well, I think it's complicated. I mean, sure. I mean, we should identify from whence we came. That's obvious. But I think that part of the problem of identifying on the class level, and I talk about this at length in my upcoming book on Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California, that'll be published within days, that part of the problem is that the descendants of the settler population have been enmeshed in class collaboration. And I think that because of their lack of class consciousness, that has driven the Black liberation movement to try to find other mechanisms for change and engines of protest. For the Black Panthers, that led them into an ill-fated, ill-devised elevation of the lumpen, which I don't think worked out very well. I think that the class collaborationism of the Euro-American working class, which is the flip side of the class struggle that some in the Euro-American working class have been involved in, that led many Black folk into a premature declaration of armed struggle, which did not necessarily end well. And in fact, when this book is published, like any book, I'm hoping that it will give rise to further reflection and further study. And to that end, I draw an analogy between what I'm talking about in Southern California and what unfolded in Zanzibar, as Tanzania, of which Zanzibar is a part, was coming to independence in the 1960s. That is to say, that what happened in Zanzibar was a considerable amount of what the Black population considered to be payback for centuries, and I do mean centuries. We're talking about before 1492 of enslavement, because of course you had a so-called Arab slave trade, for lack of a better term, that precedes 1492 by several centuries. And so these questions with regard to the Black question, they're very complicated. And what happens is that they have not been given the kind of analysis and study and intelligence that they so richly deserve, even by those who consider themselves to be revolutionary.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and I would like to talk to you further about A.M. Babu, but we'll say that for another time. Because Babu was Ayuko Babu, a mutual friend of both of ours. That's where he got his name from A.M. Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu. But can we talk about Macron's speech at the Sorbonne? He what do you think about him? His soccer game? Did you see him playing, AKA football? His football game?
No, I missed it. Tell me about it.
No, I think they let him score a goal. He seemed to be. I give him, for what little I know about soccer, I give him a 4 or 5 in terms of being a soccer player. You know, he can at least move a little bit. But it was an exhibition game. They were making trying to raise some money for, I think, some NGOs. And he played, and the goalie allowed him to make a goal. But he put it this way: he could move better than Trump or
That's
Biden.
not saying that much.
No. I agree with you. As Sam Cooke would say, point well taken.
Well, that's, as they say, damning with faint praise. But with regard to Mr. Macron's speech, it was billed as an important speech. And what he lays out is what he sees as a fear, which I think has already arrived, that the European Union is becoming a vassal state of the United States of America. I think it's already happened. He should be given an award for being obvious with regard to the speech. And to be frank with you, I'm not sure if there's a way to change that trajectory. I say that because the European Union, sort of, to use a football or soccer term, they wrong-footed themselves when they admitted into their ranks these formerly socialist Eastern European countries like Hungary and Poland, well, particularly Poland, which are pro-Yankee and wield influence within the EU on a pro-Yankee basis, unless they, or Mr. Macron, is able to oust these countries from the EU, which I don't see happening, because the capitalists in France like the idea of having these captive markets in Eastern Europe. This idea of the EU being a vassal of the United States is already baked into the cake. Now, there's one caveat, which is that the EU, or at least France and Germany, because of course the European countries have a certain amount of latitude with regard to foreign policy, I don't really see them going along with US imperialism's new Cold War against China. I say that because the German and French capitalists rely heavily upon the Chinese market for both consuming their goods and for manufacturing goods that are exported from China. And I'm thinking of, for example, Volkswagen, which has a dire fate ahead when it tries to compete not only with Tesla of the United States, which also manufactures in China, but also BYD, which makes electric vehicles as well in China and is a Chinese corporation. So Mr. Macron, the most charitable thing you can say is that he's paying the price, and his wing of the ruling class is paying the price for misguided policies that have led France and the EU to the brink of catastrophe. But shed no tears for Mr. Macron, because he's also the author of the latest boneheaded idea from the European Union, which is to send troops into Ukraine to battle the Russians, which could lead to World War III. And if anything, will lead to a further split within the ranks of the EU, because Germany's not on board. It's had a bitter experience with regard to confrontation with Russia. I'm referring, of course, to World War II. And as well, the United States might not necessarily be supportive. But there you have it. And I should add another footnote before I turn the mic back over to you, which is that I think that Mr. Macron is upset with the United States because the United States, in its eagerness to attain total domination of planet Earth, which is a losing battle given the rise of China, which had helped to assist in the 1970s and 1980s, the United States is trying to elbow France out of its neo-colonial empire in Africa. Speaking of Niger and the Sahel states, the recent news being Gabon, the country which endured regime change in August of 2023, is now going to be asking French troops to leave. And I'm sure Uncle Sam, the United States, feels that it can replace French troops, just like it thought it could replace French troops when they were evacuated from Niger. So I would say that the imperialist countries, France and the United States, have maneuvered themselves into a corner where they are either going to have to risk World War III by coming into conflict with China. And as I said, I don't see France going along with that harebrained US idea, or they will have to accommodate themselves to a new international order. And as I try to comfort these imperialists, and I chose my word carefully, if you look at the Netherlands, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, it was seen as a rising power, perhaps destined for global domination, but it didn't work out. However, if you go to Amsterdam or Rotterdam or The Hague, in many sections, they're very pleasant. And so the imperialists need to cool their jets, that world domination might not be in the cards, but at least they'll be able to survive. And some of them might even be able to thrive if they can adjust accordingly.
You are listening to Diasporic Music with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, speaking to Dr. Gerald Horne. And there's some more questions, Melinda.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to go into Blinken in China.
Well, this is the problem of the U.S. imperialism. Here's the new strategy of U.S. imperialism towards China. Before February 2022, in the special military operation Russia engineered in Ukraine, the idea was to lure Russia into a conflict in Ukraine, turn the ruble into rubble, as President Biden put it, inflict a stinging military defeat on Moscow, leading to the collapse of the regime and a takeover by pro-imperialist elements, which then could be joined with the North Atlantic countries to take on China. That's not working out very well. So the latest wrinkle is to go to China, as Mr. Blinken has just done and is still doing, and threaten China with sanctions unless it breaks relations with Russia, even though there's no basis in international law for doing so. Why should China observe U.S. law, observe U.S. sanctions laws, or EU sanctions laws. And in any case, it's sort of nonsensical because basically Biden is saying, look here, Chairman Xi Jinping, we want you to break relations with Russia so we can more effectively come after you. And so they must think the Chinese are stupid. I mean, if I can see that thousands of miles away in North America, I'm sure that the Chinese can see it. And so this is basically a fool's errand that Mr. Blinken is on. But on the other hand, it's a riverboat gamble because the United States is building up these military alliances to threaten the People's Republic of China. We all know about the military alliance involving Japan. We talked about Prime Minister Kishida in the White House just a few days ago, along with President Marcos of the Philippines, as part of this anti-China cabal. We know about Australia being part of this anti-China cabal. We know that India is being lured into that anti-China cabal, but that's going to be difficult because, of course, India has as a major trading partner the People's Republic of China, although we can't rule it out altogether. And I should also say, and perhaps you detect this in the Canadian press, and I'm sure you do, that there is a bit of nervousness about the BJP and the Hindu chauvinism of Prime Minister Modi. I think that if the imperialist power in Washington had their druthers, they would not prefer to see Modi continue. They would prefer Rahul Gandhi of the Nehru Gandhi clan. However, that doesn't seem to be in the cards. Election results will be announced in India within a few weeks. It's expected that the BJP will prevail. And so you see that the imperialists are playing a dangerous game, just like they built up China in order to encircle Moscow and the Soviet Union, which I guess they feel it worked out fine, even though it created a juggernaut in China. Now they're trying to build up India. Apple was thinking about moving to India, for example, from China. So they're trying to build up India to try to encircle China and bring down China. But they might wind up at the end of the day confronting this Hindu chauvinist power, which, as you know, from following politics in Vancouver, has not hesitated, we are told at least, to interfere in the internal relations of Canada, treating Canada like it's a sort of 98-pound weakling on the beach. I'm speaking of the allegation that Indian authorities were involved in assassinations of Sikh activists in British Columbia. That may be a harbinger of what's to come if India is continuing to be built up by the imperialists.
I think that the Modi is gone too far in terms of his chauvinism. I think that there's a section of the Canadian. I think that the ruling circles are. Some people are. He's what is the word I'm looking for? He's shaming the people because he's too blatant. He's too crass. He has no class. What is a savoir-faire? I'm a country. Yeah, I'm a country boy, so my Ebonics is getting in my way. But he has little or no class, and that chauvinism is. Don't you think in the 21st century that we can't really get away with a whole lot of things that we get away 10 years ago?
Well, as I said, I think he's showing disrespect for Canada. I mean, and I shouldn't just say Canada because we cannot rule out that he's been doing the same thing in the United States, perhaps in a more subtle manner, for example. Right. So I think that the imperialist powers that keep creating, from their point of view, these Frankenstein monsters, they, in my book, I Dare Say, the reader, I have an article in there where I invoke the metaphor of the well-known U.S. novel by Herman Melville, Moby Dick, about this seafarer who's driven mad as he tries to harpoon and otherwise corral the great white whale. And the metaphor I use is that the great white whale of the 20th century, from the point of view of the imperialists, was the Soviet Union. And if you look at it on the map, it sort of resembled a great white whale. It certainly was the biggest landmass on planet Earth. And trying to bring down the Soviet Union, it reminds us of the metaphor for the Vietnam War. You have to destroy the village in order to save it. So the imperialists had to wound imperialism in order to try to save imperialism. And if you tried to raise these questions with them, they ruled you out of order at best. They put you in jail or tried to kill you at worst. And then all the while shouting from the rooftops about how this is the epicenter of freedom of speech and liberal democracy, and you have the right to speak your mind, etc. And so this is how it eventuates, with imperialism in a doom loop, as they say nowadays, facing eclipse, to use the noun of a few weeks ago, and with its future hardly assured.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Dr. Gerald Horne, and what is your take on the student protests in Israel?
Well, the protests, let me elaborate on the protests here in the United States about Israel. Of course, the most recent protests have been at Northeastern University in Boston, protests at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where I'll be next week. As a matter of fact, we need to talk because I may be on a plane next week and may not be able to talk with you. So we need to confer about that. But George Washington University in Washington, D.C. is not known like the University of Southern California as a hotbed of student radicalism, but they have an encampment there. George Washington University is better known as a feeder campus for the CIA. That's where a lot of FBI and CIA leaders come from. As a matter of fact, J. Edgar Hoover, who led the FBI for 50 years, his alma mater was, you guessed it, George Washington University. I mentioned Emory University in Atlanta, University of Texas at Austin, Washington University in St. Louis, my old hometown, also a campus not known for student activism. They have an encampment there. The issue, however, is that the semester will be closing down at many of these schools rather shortly. And so the encampments will be disassembled. But hopefully the lessons learned from this experience will not be disassembled. And I dare say that they won't be, because their focus, speaking of historic Palestine, remains on fire. That is to say that Israel is now contemplating the worst of all fates for Palestinians, that is to say an invasion of Rafah alongst the Egyptian border, and seeking to drive Palestinians into the Sinai Desert, Egyptian territory, turning an Israeli problem into an Egyptian problem, which could threaten the already shaky rule of President al-Sisi, which can inflame the ire of many in the Arab world. And pay attention to what's happening in Jordan, which collaborated and cooperated with the Israelis in terms of their attacks on Iran, which enraged a good deal of the Jordanian population, which happens to be of Palestinian heritage, at least a goodly number are, and are hostile to the monarchy, which is seen correctly as a kind of British implant. In fact, the king is Arabic. I'll say it's better than your Arabic, but to even mouth that kind of assertion gives you an idea of what kind of foreign implant this Jordanian monarchy, the so-called Hashemite kingdom, has been and is. And Iran as well is gaining support. I noticed that just this past weekend, There was a meeting in Kazakhstan of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, headed, as its name suggests, by China and Russia, although Iran is a cooperating member. You can bet your bottom dollar that further attacks on Iran will not be greeted with indifference by China and Russia. So once again, Israel has painted itself into a corner, like France has painted itself into a corner, like US imperialism has painted itself into a corner. And to look at it from 30,000 feet, all of these situations are a reflection of a general crisis of imperialism, a paradigm shift on planet Earth with the increasing eclipsing of the North Atlantic powers and their puppet regimes in places like Israel and Jordan, and the continuing ascension of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the aforementioned incoming members.
And you're listening to Diasporic music. I think we have about 3 minutes in my Arabic. I know about 5 words in Arabic, but in my Arabic is probably better than my English, because like I say, I'm an Ebonic speaker. But Melinda, do you have any more questions, or what else do we want to talk about? Melinda and Gerald?
I wanted to remind again about the book, the upcoming book in May.
Oh yes, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, of course. Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Norman Richmond is a character in these pages. His attempt to escape from Los Angeles in the draft is detailed in these pages. Therefore, you are a character in history, which means you will live forever. You are eternal. No, seriously. I mean, it's Norman Richmond plays a heroic role in these pages, along with others. So pre-orders will be available as recently as soon as this coming week. Go to the website of international publishers and order your copy.
And thank you very much for including me, and hopefully my granddaughter Eliana will be hope to make her proud. And last question, when are you coming this way again to Toronto?
Oh, it's no telling, man. As I said, we got to talk. I'm going to be in DC next week and working on another project. So then I have to go to London a few weeks after that, and other trips too. So it's hard to say. All
right. Is there anything you could like to add, Melinda?
No, we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week, and we'll check in about when we're going to pre-record for next week since you're on a plane.
Okay.
All right, I forgot we have